Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister here at Westminster Presbyterian Church in beautiful downtown Minneapolis. For more than 40 years, the Westminster Town Hall Forum has been bringing voices of conscience from an ethical perspective to this region, and we're grateful to continue to do that even during COVID-19. We're doing all of our programming online now. We hope you're accessing it there, and we do look forward to the time when we can be together in person. Westminster's forum is supported by individuals, you and I and others. 85% of the forum's support comes from individual contributions. So I encourage you to consider making a gift to the forum at westminsterforum.org. Our first guest of this 2021 series is Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She will be greeted and in a conversation with our guest moderator, Dan Crocker from Minnesota Public Radio today. We're pleased to be partnering with the Great Northern Festival for the first time, bringing Dr. Johnson in partnership with the festival. The festival is an attempt to think again about our cold winters, what we can learn about climate change, how we can celebrate this area in which we live, and Dr. Johnson is able to help us think through some of those issues today. I'm pleased to introduce Kate Nordstrom, who is the executive and artistic director of the Great Northern Festival. Kate will say a word about the festival and introduce us to our speakers today. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Tim. We are so grateful to be partnering with Westminster Town Hall Forum for the first time. Beyond celebrating our cold, creative winters here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Great Northern seeks to be an advocate for protecting winter as climate change threatens. Today's conversation with Dr. Johnson kicks off our Climate Solutions Lunchtime series, which continues next week, Monday through Friday, and is free for all. This will also live on our website ongoing. You can find the schedule at the website, which is thegreatnorthernfestival.com. Dr. Johnson has been called the most influential marine biologist of our time. And her focus on climate change inspires so many, including myself. Her new book, All We Can Save, offers truth, courage, and solutions from women at the forefront of the climate movement. It is an honor to have her with us. I want to thank the Great Northern's climate-specific sponsors, including the McKnight Foundation, Minneapolis Foundation, Ascot Finlayson, Greater MSP, and Climate Generation. Thanks to NPR for broadcasting. And thanks finally to Westminster Town Hall Forum for the work that they've been doing for so many years, engaging the public on issues both pressing and existential. We hope that you enjoy today's offering, and I'll turn it over now to Dan Crocker.
My name is Dan Crocker. I'm a correspondent with Minnesota Public Radio. And it is my distinct privilege to be speaking today with Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She is a marine biologist, a climate activist. She's the co-editor of a new book, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. She's also the co-host of the podcast, How to Save a Planet. And I know I'm leaving a lot out, but Dr. Johnson, it's a real privilege to be speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us for this.
Thanks for having me and for the lovely introduction.
So we're going to talk a lot about climate science, about climate justice, some big issues, but I was hoping to start briefly with you a little bit. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you became who you are and are doing the work that you're doing. I mean, were you one of those kids who, you know, when they were 8 years old, knew that you wanted to be a marine biologist and you had your life mapped out?
I was 5.
You were 5.
I mean, I think that's pretty common, right? Like these dream jobs that we have as kids, it's pretty common to like have one. It's not very common to have the support of people around you who are like, sure, that seems fine if that's what you want to do. You know, my parents were just like, okay, if you love the ocean and want to study it, that's called being a marine biologist. And I was like, great, sign me up. And I think there's part of that that's almost like a lack of imagination. I'm just like, well, this is what I said I'm going to do. Like, I'm going to do it. But there's another part of it that's, not just the fact that I'm stubborn, but the way that I realized how ocean science, marine biology really did intersect with all of the big things I cared about, right? So when I was 5, it was on this family trip to Key West, Florida, where I saw a coral reef for the first time through the bottom of a glass bottom boat. And I was just completely blown away by this whole other universe that existed under the surface. And I just had a lot of questions, and it was so colorful. But little did I know at the time that I was falling in love with coral reefs as they were already dying. And so as you get older and realize that, then the mission becomes more like, oh, this thing needs protecting, right? So when I was 10, though, my second dream job was to become a civil rights lawyer. I was learning about the civil rights movement in the United States, and I very specifically wanted to be the lawyer that got the next Martin Luther King out of jail. That seemed like a safe but useful thing to dedicate my life to. And then I wanted to be a park ranger when I started backpacking in the Rockies. And then I wanted to be an environmental lawyer once I developed this deeper understanding for like, oh, there are good guys and bad guys, and like we can take them to court to protect nature. And there was this moment at the end of college and a few years after, when I was working at the Environmental Protection Agency in DC, that I realized that if you mash all those 4 dream jobs together, that's ocean conservation, right? And then if you add in, right, because you need to understand the science, you're doing the protection, there's certainly a legal and policy aspect to it, as well as justice, thinking about the communities who are most impacted by ocean degradation and climate impacts along the coasts. So that was the moment where I was like, no, really, I could spend my whole life doing this. And when you layer climate on top of that, then you start to think about like different solutions that you want to prioritize once you have an understanding of how this is the global context within which all these other things are happening. So I guess I'm like stubborn, but also completely committed to like the all of the above choice approach to life. And so I've worked really hard to basically stay a generalist.
I love it. Did your work in climate change as a climate activist and doing all this work, I mean, did that grow directly out of your background as a marine biologist and seeing, you mentioned already, learning about the coral reefs dying? I mean, was your climate work a sort of did it come directly from that?
So, when I was doing my PhD research, when I was doing ocean policy, working with island governments and communities in the Caribbean, it was very much like climate is the context within which we are creating marine protected areas, and that's offering this sense of urgency. It's like things are changing so much, we need to be taking that into account. But it was really like ocean conservation as the lens. And now, given how much the climate crisis has accelerated, even in the last decade since I was in graduate school, climate is now number one, and thinking about how the ocean is not just a victim, but a hero in terms of climate solutions, is a big part of how I approach my work. So that has been a shift over the last few years. And certainly like many people, the last 4 years of the Trump administration certainly lit a fire under me, seeing the 100 environmental regulations that were rolled back, seeing how many politicians were denying like the fundamental scientific facts. So at a moment where we very much needed to be debating, what do we do exactly in a way that makes sense, not just with the science, but the economic context and with, the social context that we live in. Instead of debating the what specifically do we do, we were still having the do we do anything debate. And if, the more you know about what's at stake, the more infuriating that lack of progress becomes. And so activist is not really a word I love as a title. The only ist, I guess, I really embrace is like marine biologist. But yeah, I mean, there comes a moment where you're just like, well, I guess if people are going to listen, then I should talk. And that's how this emerged. And more specifically, my mom sort of made fun of me for this, but right after the Women's March, the first Women's March, right after the day after the Trump inauguration, scientists watching that said, we need to march for science, because the ability to make good policy, good regulations, good laws depends on facts. Like, that is the foundation. We need to understand the world so we can then figure out what to do, whether it's, public health or climate or environmental protections or whatever the thing is. And it became clear that all that was at risk. And I was reading very late at night an article about these data scientists who were downloading all the government data that they could before the inauguration, in the months between the election and the inauguration, downloading all the EPA data sets, downloading all of the NASA data sets, everything that was public they could get their hands on, because they were afraid it was going to disappear. And with it gone, then they wouldn't be required to make policy that took that information to heart. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency set up a whole mirror website for January 20th. 2017, so that stuff wouldn't disappear. And that was the moment that I was like, I guess I have to become more active publicly and say this is not okay. Like, the scientific method is very useful as a way of understanding the world, and that understanding can be used to make good decisions that protect all of us and the world we live in. So why would we not make good decisions based on good information? And I ended up becoming one of the leaders of the March for Science to get scientists to start speaking up, not just in the US, but globally, because what we were seeing here in terms of a political shift was happening in so many other countries. These shifts towards authoritarianism and disregard for government checks and balances and systems.
You brought up a lot I want to come back to. You talked about solutions, which I know you talk a lot about. Big fan of solutions. And I love the idea of the ocean as a hero. So we'll talk more about that. But I was hoping, you also talked about stakes. And I was hoping maybe to frame the conversation, you could, and I know this is a big question, but lay out what the stakes are. And, what are the facts telling us? How big is this problem that we're facing?
It's the biggest problem humanity has ever faced. The future of life on Earth, the form that takes, is what's at stake. And all of whatever variable you look at, whether it's temperature, whether it's loss of habitats, whether it's increase in wildfires or sea level rise or ocean acidification or droughts or floods or hurricanes, everything is just like off the charts. Like, we have completely changed the balance of nature. And so when I think of what's at stake, I think about what futures are possible, right? The future where everything is pristine and all the species that have gone extinct are back. Like, that is not a possible future. There are, 8 billion of us on the planet. We are part of nature, right? We are one of 8 million species. It's not that we're not supposed to be here. It's just that we're not supposed to be ruining everything. So when I think about what's at stake, I think about, for example, the difference between 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which is what some scientists would say is like a reasonable sort of best case at this point scenario. And given the crazy extreme weather events that we've seen just in the last year, we know that version of the future is going to be pretty tough still, right? We're at a little over 1 degree Celsius of global warming so far. So double that and just imagine sort of what will be unleashed. But what is also possible is a future of 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming, which is just apocalyptic, right? We're talking about hundreds of millions of people losing their lives, being displaced from their homes, massive food insecurity, just extreme weather events that like no movie could even depict. starvation, certainly the loss of coral reefs would happen at 2 degrees. So like, the loss of like entire, like the world as we know, it just like wouldn't look familiar. And this is going to sound maybe lame. I get called hopeful all the time, which cracks me up. I think of myself as sort of a brutal realist, but when we look at the scientific projections on any variable of change in the environment, there's this uncertainty, right? There's a range of possible futures. So when I look at those graphs, I'm like, oh my God, we have so much work to do. But I also think, well, what can I do to make sure it's 2 degrees and not 4? Because so much hangs in that balance. And I think it's important not to be naive. Like, we can't go back to normal, whatever that is. I mean, I think we're all sort of having that discussion in the context of the pandemic. Like, what does back to normal mean? Like, normal actually wasn't that great. But what sort of future world can we create? And so that's the direction that my work is taking now, is starting to think about, okay, well, like, what does it look like if we get it right? If we implement all the climate solutions we have at our fingertips, if we electrify, the grid, if we transform, transportation, if we think about buildings and building efficiency and agriculture and land use and protected areas and restoring ecosystems, like if we think about all this stuff we already know how to do, what do we get, right? Because we know the bad version of the future. I think it's like relatively easy to extrapolate that, right? We have images of that in popular culture. We have sort of like the hell, fire, and brimstone version of the future. We have the day after tomorrow, uninhabitable earth version of the future, but we don't have, beyond some sort of like techno-utopian nonsense, Jetsons version of the future. Like, we don't really know what it looks like if we get it right. And so we're sort of sauntering away from this apocalypse. Like, we know that's bad, but you don't have anything specific to envision that we're running toward. And so we're just not really running. And I think that's part of the problem. And so that's where there's a huge opportunity for this cultural shift and the creation of like this abundance of artistic production to help us see like this is going to be a lot of work to address the climate crisis. But like, show me that it's worth it. Like, let me feel and see and hear and smell. Like, what does that look like? And then maybe I'll chip in, right? So that's kind of where my head's at.
That's interesting to hear you explain it that way, because we often frame it as like this big fight, this big battle against climate change. And we don't really ever talk about what we're fighting for. It doesn't seem like, and it sounds like almost like you're pitching that we need to envision that. We need to have something that we're working towards to get people excited about and rallied around.
Yeah, the Green New Deal was in many ways a vision statement for the world that we could have. And for those who haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it, even if you think you won't like it, because it's quite short. It's like 13 pages, double spaced in massive font.
So like 5 minutes to read it. Yeah,
it'll take you like 5 minutes. And then we can have a real, debate amongst all of ourselves. Like, what parts do we like? What parts do we not like? What should we do first? Like, there's plenty to debate. But right now, I feel like the public discourse around the Green New Deal is like, I like it or hate it, but no one's read it. So go read it. And then there are plenty of valid perspectives, And so that's sort of like one version of that. And that certainly inspired some art. But I think every TV show and movie should acknowledge that our changed and continually changing climate is the context within which all of the action and plot occurs. It's not that it has to be the story, but like, that's the world we live in. And we're just ignoring it in most of our pop culture right now.
We're hearing a lot about this target of zero emissions by 2050. Do you agree that that's something that's the target we need to shoot for? That's what we need to focus on?
Yeah. That's what the science says. The trick is that it's usually listed as net zero. So there's like, you can keep burning some fossil fuels if you like plant more trees, kind of fuzzy math that's happening back there. But yes, we need to stop changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. as soon as possible. And I think it's really important to also set and conceptualize interim goals. And so the Biden administration's commitment during the campaign and in the transition has been to have 100% clean electricity by 2035. And that is an achievable goal, but not an easy one to achieve, right? To get completely off fossil fuels, so that every time we turn in the lights or plug in our laptop, it's all coming from a clean energy source. But we can do it. We just have to go all in and have coordinated government effort, have corporations do that part, have the cultural shift that accelerates things and puts pressure on politicians. And what we see in the polling is that across the political spectrum, people want clean energy. Like, people want green jobs. They want to be part of building the future. And so we've sort of been sucked into this narrative that there's polarization around every environmental issue. There's certainly and it sort of like doesn't even matter if people like quote unquote believe in climate change, as if it's like Santa Claus or something and it's a choice. But there's even people who would deny the science of climate change would say, of course we want to build wind turbines so that farmers have a secondary source of income and we have local electricity that we can depend on that's not polluting our air and water, right? So I think if we even just went with the things that a majority of Americans already support and charged full steam ahead with those, we would be so much further towards where we need to go. Kind
of the low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
I want to talk.
But the low-hanging fruit is like electrifying everything. Like, it's pretty. It's like a papaya.
I want to talk more about the new administration and policy, but I want to talk about your new book that you've co-edited, which I have a copy of and I've read. It's called All We Can Save, and it's this collection of wonderful essays and poems. And it's really each one about how one person can make a difference in this. And I wanted to ask about the subtitle. The subtitle is Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And I know you chose those words carefully and deliberately. I was hoping you could explain why you chose those words.
This book had a hard time finding a name. So it's 41 essays from all sorts of different climate experts across activism and science and policy and law and agriculture and art and design, architecture. And so how do you name that that's either not like so fluffy as to be meaningless or like so sort of didactic as to be like unappealing, right? Or to be sort of ridiculously naive, like How We Save the World, or like some, title like my podcast.
I was going to say,
which is tongue in cheek, but also I think delightful. And then there are like 17 poems in there, and then quotes from other climate leaders, and then all this art. And to think of like how you name something like that, the title came from a stanza, was inspired by a stanza from a poem by Adrienne Rich, which starts, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." And that is the most succinct and compelling version of sort of the why and the how that either Catherine Wilkinson, my co-editor, or I had ever seen. And of course, we didn't want to name a book All I Cannot Save, right? The implication is that there's so much we still can save, and let's focus on that, even though we can't save everything. And this reconstitute the world piece, this putting the pieces back together idea, this like having no extraordinary power, but finding your people and doing it together. You mentioned that the book is it's, an example of how much individuals can do to change things. But I would say it's individuals who are part of collectives telling the story of their collective efforts, of the campaigns or initiatives that they've led, and like why or how they've been successful, or broader lessons they've learned from engaging deeply with the writings and expertise of others, right? It's very much focused around this idea of community. And that's why the we in All We Can Save is so important to us. But the subtitle, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, we think of as this trifecta of like the approach that we think is needed, right? Truth, obviously, in this moment of climate science denial and all of that, like we need to face the facts. We need to be using science and data to make decisions. So truth is paramount, and obviously getting more people on board with what that truth is. But there's only a single-digit percentage of Americans who are full-blown climate science deniers.
Oh, it's that low.
So we could actually solve this without them, right? Take the 91% and like charge ahead. There's people who are another like maybe 10% who are sort of dismissive, but not full-blown denial. But it is the vast majority of Americans who are like to some degree concerned and aware. And it's now the majority who are like concerned or very concerned. So we actually do have the majority opinion, public opinion behind climate action. And so if truth is the first piece, and there's obviously a lot of work to be done on combating misinformation, then courage is the ingredient for what to do when we have that truth, that understanding, and facing, that the future may not be that great. Almost certainly won't be like a walk in the park, right? Like we have like messed up the carbon cycle and the water cycle, and like all the nutrient cycles, and ecosystems are really struggling. And that is the foundation for all life. We like to think that we sort of live outside of nature, but really we could not be more dependent on the rest of life on the planet. So this courage that it takes to act in the face of an unknown outcome, right? We don't know if our efforts are going to add up to much or enough. But like, why not act as if and try? Because how lame would it be to just give up on the future of life on Earth, right? So it does take a little bit of a leap of faith to do things when there's no guarantee, but that's where we find ourselves. So let's be courageous in the face of the facts. And then this like really rigorous and almost myopic focus on solutions, I think, is critical, because it's so easy to just like depress each other with dire scientific projections and never get to the now what part. There's this whole sort of like segment of the population of people who are quite up to date on like the most apocalyptic projections that scientists are putting out there. And they're often, very often, white men who want to reply to everything people like me post on the internet and say like, well, actually, like, what's even the point? Because like X, Y, and Z. And so I'm saying, well, would you like to give up on all of humanity then? Like, is that the alternative? Like, what are you doing to be a part of the solution, right? And so this whole group of like doomer dudes, as Mary Anais Heglar has sort of named them, it's like not a helpful part of the conversation. Like truth, and then courage, and then solutions. Like, I'm not going to deny the truth, but like and now what piece people often want to skip. And honestly, like when we're part of the actions that are needed, it's a lot less overwhelming and scary, because at the very least, we will earn what I have always wanted on a gravestone, which is she tried, right? Like, that's all we can do. And the trick then is to understand like the full spectrum of climate solutions we have at our fingertips, right? We know about renewable energy. We know about regenerative agriculture. We know about, farming in seaweed in the ocean as a climate solution. We know about public transportation and electric cars and the cultural shifts that are needed and raising the bar in the status quo and all the policy changes. Like, we know actually what needs to be done. We have a very long list. Restoring ecosystems, I always want to say, like, people leave out the fact that nature needs to be protected and restored. And so the question is not like, how can any one person do all of that? But like, what role should we each play? Is there a particular solution we want to work on? Is there a particular way to accelerate the implementation of solutions that we want to contribute to? And I think that what's missing in this whole conversation, and what in part comes through the book, why people keep sort of like attaching the word hope to the book, is because there is a joy in the trying and the doing and the victories and learnings along the way, if we're doing this in collaboration, especially, that like, this can be fun. Like, imagining and creating a whole different way of living on the planet in community with each other. Like, that's the way I want it. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. Like, that's what I want to be a part of. So people always think that those of us who work on climate are just like depressed, sitting alone in our houses, like drinking too much. And we are like, over here coming up with creative ways to reinvent the future. And so I think that's so Catherine and I, with the book, have launched a nonprofit called the All We Can Save Project to carry forward this work of welcoming people into the climate movement, helping them find where they belong, amplifying the voices of women in particular, and women of color more specifically, who are doing this critical work that we don't often hear about because of the power structures of our sort of like white supremacist patriarchy that continues to rear its head, as we keep seeing in violent fashion. So what does a feminist climate renaissance look like? Where everyone is welcome at the table, where it's a rebirth instead of a battle, as you described, right? We're not tearing something apart. We're building something new together.
So needless to say, there are no doomer dudes featured in your book.
Zero.
And I gather it is not an accident that it's all women who are featured in the book. And you just talked about the feminist climate renaissance and what that would look like. Talk about why you specifically wanted to raise the voices of these women and what that renaissance will look like.
So Catherine and I came up with the idea of this book when we were at the Aspen Institute at some sort of climate symposium. And it was like all the usual characters and sort of like fancy academia, philanthropy, nonprofit executives, corporate sustainability officers kind of crowd, a lot of self-congratulations, a lot of parading out, indigenous leaders to do a cute thing that everyone could clap and then ignore them and not fund their work, sort of like the typical ways that we've been failing for decades. And I think it's important to know like how we've known about the pending climate crisis, which is now thoroughly here, since the 70s. Like Exxon's own scientists were doing this research in the 70s. So this is not new. It's just that we are finally breaking through the sort of like misinformation campaigns and science denial that those very same fossil fuel corporations who discovered just what the risks were, then sort of like tried to pull the wool over all of our eyes. And so we're in this context trying to lead some sort of workshop, and we're just so frustrated because it becomes clear as you start to see the same people, the same events, the same sort of small crew of mostly white men as the gatekeepers and the people holding the power and the dollars, that new ideas are not being tried, right? And like, obviously we need to, we need some new approaches. We need some new leaders.
Because we haven't fixed this yet.
You got to make it, like, it hasn't succeeded. So like, why not try something new? And so we kind of just like walked out of this conference, went for a walk in the woods, in the aspen groves of Aspen, Colorado, and started to think about what would it look like to amplify a whole new set of voices of so many of the people we know who are leading on climate, who have an extremely hard time funding their work, who have an extremely hard time getting a platform for their insights and ideas that people really do need to be listening to. And, you know, books are still very much a core and traditional path to thought leadership. We knew that most people we knew did not want to, or, you know, have time to stop doing their very critical work to write a book. So how could we, in a sense, bring the book to them? And instead of then you having to read 40 books, you can read 40 essays and sort of gain these gems of wisdom across the spectrum of work that's being done. And so that's kind of how the idea came to be. You know, and then we had to convince a publisher that people would actually want to read this book. But women in particular, just because of the numbers of like, women were not getting listened to. They weren't getting funded, women of color in particular. It's just like, that's what the math looks like. And on the flip side, when you do include women equally in the decision-making processes around climate, you have better outcomes quantitatively in terms of policy, in terms of the amount of land protected. There's actually like quite rigorous social science around different outcomes when you have different people at the table, that it actually does matter who's in the room interpreting the truth with courage.
In one of your podcast episodes, there was a nugget that I just found remarkable about how women and girls just are a lot better at explaining climate change, at changing people's minds.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit more about what women-centered leadership looks like and why that could be such a powerful agent for change.
What you just mentioned is the result of a study about basically like young people are much more aware and sort of like accepting of the facts of climate change. And so the question is like, how do we change people's minds who are older and denying the realities that we're facing? And the answer is girls are the most influential when it comes to changing the minds of their conservative dads. And this, at first, you're like, really? Okay. And it's girls in particular. It's like dad wants to be a good dad to his daughter. Like, that's his sweetheart. He wants to like have her respect. He wants to, you know, protect her future. So there's like sort of like some nonsense gender norms mashed up in like why they actually care about their daughter's thing. And it's like, I will protect you, sort of like machoism. If that is what we need to harness the power of to save the planet, then I guess I'm here for it. But we also need to destroy toxic masculinity because that's really holding us back. And I think it's very powerful to imagine all these teenage girls having these conversations with their families. And it's important to note that this is over time, right? It's not like a girl one day is like, Mom, Dad, we need to have a talk about climate change. Like, why don't you believe in this science? Like, it's science. Do you not believe in the science of like how cell phones are made? Like, we all use computers, like we all, you know, we go to the doctor, like that's all science. Why are you against this science? Right? Like the way that kids sort of have this ability to be like, would you not care about my future? Even if it's like 99% sure, would you not want to maybe do something about this pending disaster? And I just remember when I was a kid and I made my parents recycle even when they knew it was nonsense and it was mostly going into the trash. And I made my parents stop smoking, right? You have this moral clarity as a child and you're like, I heard you're going to die 7 years earlier if you don't stop smoking. And like, why would you do that to me? Leave me with no parents too soon, you know? And your parents are like, oh God, I can't really argue with that, right? So what's most remarkable about this is not just sort of the results being more that it's girls in like sort of a family discussion context, but that what we've seen in the youth climate movement globally is that girls are overwhelmingly the leaders. We think about Greta Thunberg starting her climate strike outside of the Swedish parliament by herself. And she has undoubtedly been a remarkable leader and inspired and mobilized many, many people around the world. But she could very well just still be sitting outside of Swedish parliament by herself. If it weren't for all the other teenage girls around the world who are like, actually, I have the same fear and I can do that where I live. I can start that with my school. I can start that outside my church. I'm going to show up outside the UN because I live in New York, right? You had all of these girls in what we like following when wise leadership emerges. And we so exalt the leaders, but if no one jumps in to help, then we don't get anywhere. And so that's what I think this like ability to start and amplify trends, essentially, like social trends, can be used for this like remarkable thing, and paired with this moral clarity that young people are able to just say, like, there actually is a right and a wrong here. It is wrong to sacrifice my future because you're greedy and or lazy, right? It is right to do what we can to make a future that holds all of us. And we need, as we age, we get so used to compromise and living in the gray area that we need young people to sort of shake us and say, get it together, grown-ups. Like, you gotta do better.
I want to shift gears a little bit because we're talking about, I'm in Minneapolis. We're talking about 7 months after George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police, not far from here. Mm-hmm. And I know you wrote several pieces after that happened. I read an op-ed you wrote in the Washington Post, I believe, that was titled, "I'm a Black Policy Expert, Racism Derails Our Efforts to Save the Planet." And I was hoping for folks listening or watching who might not immediately see the connections between, this work on saving the planet, on fixing climate change, and this work to dismantle racism. Help us out. Help us draw the connections and how these are intertwined.
So I think when we think about the intersections of race and climate, we usually think about like who's getting screwed, right? We think about Hurricane Katrina, for example, and how the Black communities really bore the vastly disproportionate burden of the impact of that storm for many reasons that had, the structures and everything that had been created before and the ways in which people helped or didn't help after the fact. But we don't think so much about the intersections of race and climate when it comes to the solution side. So in the same sense that leaving women out of equal roles of decision-making on climate is literally a recipe for failure. We know this quantitatively. It's the same to leave people of color out of these rooms of power. And the way and it's not just like diversity because it's nice. It's like, do we want to succeed? Yes or no? And so this op-ed that you're referring to in the Washington Post, I wrote sort of out of fury and heartache, seeing all this brutality, this murder, this racism play out violently again and again and again, all across this country. And I just lost the ability to just get on with my day. I sort of have a reputation for being extremely productive, and, I can usually just flip on what I call robot mode and just keep getting things done, and checking things off my to-do list actually makes me feel better. At least I'm getting something done, but I just couldn't anymore. And I ended up writing what is essentially a letter to white environmentalists to say, you can't do this without us. You simply won't succeed. And that's because in one sense, and sort of on one hand, people of color actually care more about the climate. We have polling from Yale and George Mason universities that says in the US, 49% of white people are concerned about the climate crisis, compared to 57% of Black people and 69% of Latinx people. So if we're trying to build like the biggest, strongest team of all time to solve the biggest challenge humanity's ever faced, like why would we not want to welcome all of these people in who are already on board, right? We don't need to focus on convincing climate science deniers. We need to just be like, who's ready? Like, let's go. And the other element of it that's ridiculous to not be welcoming of everyone in is because like what we need to do to address the climate crisis is transform our societies and our society and economy, right? And this needs to happen at every level. So what we need not just different leaders, we need more leaders. We need climate leaders in every single community figuring out how they're going to do that transformation in a way that like makes sense in that sort of geopolitical, cultural, economic context, right? The United States is obviously far from a monolith. And so when I think about the intersection of race and climate, I just think we need like all of the wisdom, we need all of the creativity, we need all of the brilliance in all of the towns and cities and rural areas if we're gonna be successful. So obviously the hurdles are that like people don't want to give up their power. They don't want to acknowledge that they've been wrong in their approach. They don't want to share the wealth. You still have like a philanthropic landscape where people want to know like your 5 million outcomes and outputs and key performance indicators for the next 5 years. And they want you to write a 20-page grant proposal for like $10,000. And we need to just do the work and we need to think about funding this stuff. Unfortunately, philanthropy is still a primary model that we're relying on, but we need to think about taking risks on climate solutions in the same way that we take risks in venture capital. Right? Like most investors expect, 2 out of 10 of the companies they invest in to be really successful. And that would be a great outcome. But we, for some reason, expect like every single philanthropic investment to lead to like a perfectly predictable, like positive outcome. And if that's the way we're approaching it, like we're not taking enough risks and we're not trying new things. And so we're going to end up with the same sort of like tiptoeing away from the apocalypse that we've been doing. So I think this is a time to be thinking super big and giving new people a chance and not just like giving them money and like leaving them out there on their own, like actually thinking about what it would mean to build circles of support around leaders. And that's what this new nonprofit, the All We Can Save project is aiming to do in part is build community around climate solutions, welcoming everybody in, but also thinking about how do we create, in essence, like the MacArthur Genius Award, like a climate genius award, to sort of unleash the brilliance that's already there and all the people who are doing incredible climate work as their side hustle, like nights and weekends, because they can't figure out how to get paid for it to do full. We can't save the planet as a side hustle. Like we need to figure out how people can do this.
That's a t-shirt
as their
slogan
primary
there.
Hustle. So that's kind of like, that's what we're gearing up to do is, the book was one iteration of highlighting this whole new cohort of women climate leaders across the spectrum of work that needs doing. Fundraising to then launch this award is the next iteration of that. We also have what we call All We Can Save circles, where people are reading the book together. The book, as you who have read it, thank you, know, is divided into these 10 sections with a few essays and poems and quotes and art in each section. And it's too much to discuss in just like one book club meeting, right? You kind of need to like think through and process all of this stuff, ideally in community. And so Catherine created essentially this like discussion guide with these questions, and our PR team that was helping us launch the book said, no one's going to do this. You've created a 10-week AP class you're expecting people to sign up to, like in this world, like where's the 2-hour, 2 glasses of Chardonnay chit chat version of the discussion guide? And we just never made that version. And we've so far had about 400 people sign up to lead these discussion circles, many of which are now completed, which means there are like thousands of people who have gone through this 10-week discussion of learning about all these different approaches to climate work and thinking about, more importantly, where do they fit into that? Where do they see themselves or the people who they know and love as fitting into this work? Because I mean, I think one of the failings of the climate movement is that we've asked everyone to essentially do the same things, right? Like you should march and you should vote for the people who get it and you should donate and you should spread the word about everything that's happening and what we should do. But that leaves out like everyone's superpowers for the most part, right? Like my podcast co-host was like, oh, I am really good at podcasts. I should maybe start a podcast about climate solutions. So I was like, yes, Alex Bloomberg, like, please use your superpowers for this moment, right? Some people are lawyers or artists or farmers, like everyone, or like they're just really cool and they can make this stuff cool. Like we need that too. And that's, I think, the moment we're in is like figuring out how we can each map the Venn diagram of like, what are our skills and resources? Like, what do we have to contribute? What is the work that needs doing and what gets us out of bed in the morning or brings us joy? And like, how can as many of us as possible be in like the epicenter of that Venn diagram?
So a question I know if there were people here live, I know they would ask, is people would ask, what can I do? How can I contribute to this? And some people might say, I don't have a superpower, which of course is not true. But what is your advice to folks who want guidance on what they can do to really make a difference?
I mean, spend some time with that Venn diagram, right? Of that map that for yourself. I mean, superpower is kind of intimidating. I get it for a lot of people, but like, what do people come to you for? What are you known for? What networks do you have access to? What like weird nerdy thing do you know a lot about? How can that be a part of the solution? And I think one thing that people often leave out is thinking about the organizations that they're already a part of, right? People think about like, I need to go, quit my job and go work for a climate nonprofit. And like, maybe that's the answer, but just as likely it's how can you show up as a teacher, as a mother, as a doctor, as an auto mechanic, as whatever you already are, and bring an understanding of how you can transform your field. So, for example, I have a friend who works in finance, and he was curious about my world of climate activism. And so he tagged along with me to a climate march that Jane Fonda was leading in Washington, D.C. called Fire Drill Fridays. And there were all these celebrities there, all these great speeches. And he was totally sort of gobsmacked by the whole thing. He was like, this is cool. What do we do next? He's like, Joaquin Phoenix is standing next to me. Like, of course I want to be part of the climate movement. And I was like, he said, do we just come back next week? And I said, no, Boris, you go back and fix your company. Like the financial services in sector has a whole lot they need to get on top of to contribute and be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And he'd been, vaguely, people wanted like eco-friendly investment options. So he'd been kind of thinking about it, but being in this group of people who were like so committed made him go back and prioritize that for his company. And a few months later, they launched a climate-friendly investing option for people's retirement savings. And that's I don't care if he ever marches again, right? So like, how can you change your organization, your school, your church, your sports teams, like your family? How do we think beyond ourselves? Because Dan, when people ask me this question, what can I do? I'm like, what can we do? right? Because the answer, like, what's like the one little thing I can do to solve the climate crisis? I'm like, no one little thing that any of us do matters. Like, this is the work of our lifetimes. And it's a matter of figuring out where we fit in and like who we're going to team up with, and like pick cool people to be on your team so that it's not miserable every day. Like, to the extent that we get that choice, like, let's take advantage of that part too, because we can't keep going if it's just a miserable slog every day. We have to be able to find joy,
like you said.
in this part.
Yeah. Dr. Johnson, I wanted to go to a question that came in from one of our listeners and viewers from Dr. Paris Edwards in Corvallis, Oregon. She asks, if you were asked to advise the new administration on your top 3 climate change-related priorities, what would they be and why? And then she asked, would you emphasize achievability, the direness of the situation, the breadth of the impact, or a combination of these?
Very, very good question with sub-questions.
Yes, always the sub-questions, right?
So I kind of mentioned before, to take a step back in the big picture, I would just say, if the Biden-Harris administration actually do what they committed to during the campaign, that would be a major step forward, right? They have committed to 100% clean energy by 2035. They have committed to protecting 30% of nature by 2030, right? These are huge commitments. And these didn't come out of nowhere. Like, no one in the primary was like, Joe Biden, climate candidate, he's got the best climate plan. Like, that was Jay Inslee. And everyone was like, why does he just, like, he won't talk about anything else, right? And when he left the race, everyone was calling his team to say, like, how can we make a better climate plan? And Elizabeth Warren picked up on his plans and added more of her own. And I helped write the Blue New Deal plan about how the ocean can be a part of the climate solutions with her policy team, and Bernie obviously had climate plans. And when it became clear that Biden was the nominee, climate activists were like, your plan was like really not good enough. So we've got a few months to fix that, right? And there were these deep discussions about how they could ratchet up their ambition. And it now is the third major thing I would say, besides 100% renewable by 2035 and protecting 30% of nature by 2030, is the commitment to 40% of the funds for this transition and addressing the climate crisis to go to communities that have historically been disadvantaged or like burdened by the impacts of climate change. So there's a built-in like percentage justice commitment in the approach, which is something I was really surprised to read. And so if the top 3 are like the 3 things they've already committed to, like, I'll take that. But the other piece I would add is that we always forget about the ocean. We just think about the atmosphere, but the ocean has absorbed about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide we've emitted because of all the fossil fuels we've burned. It's absorbed about 90% of the heat that we've trapped with all those greenhouse gases that are creating this blanket in our atmosphere. So the ocean is really buffering us from the planet would be like 90 degrees hotter if the ocean hadn't absorbed all of this heat. And of course, that's ruining the ocean. It's leading to ocean acidification. It's like melting ecosystems and coral reefs, making it hard for animals to grow shells. Fish are moving towards the poles in search of cooler water. Like, it's disrupting the ocean. But the ocean is not just a victim. As I mentioned before, it's also a hero. The ocean, like, wetlands and mangroves and seagrasses can absorb like 5 times often more carbon in their soils than a forest on land. So we're all obsessed with planting trees, and I am in favor of planting trees, but we need to think about coastal ecosystems and restoring and protecting them as well. We need to think about that not just as a carbon sequestration opportunity, but also as like a physical barrier that's protecting us from all this extreme weather that's coming towards the coasts, as the habitat for the fisheries species that we want to eat. That's the nursery habitat right along the coast. We need to think about how we're ramping up renewable energy offshore, in particular offshore wind energy, which could essentially power coastal cities, we just don't have enough room for solar panels and stuff on land in cities, right? So, but we need to produce energy ideally close to where it's being used. So in coastal cities, which represent 1 in 3 Americans live in a coastal city approximately. This is not some like coastal elite thing. This is a third of us. So how are we going to make that clean energy transition in coastal cities? How are we going to shift our food system to be more sustainable? And that's thinking about how we're farming the ocean in a way that is sustainable, thinking about farming seaweeds and oysters and mussels and clams and scallops. And they actually improve ecosystem health and absorb carbon while they're doing that. So I think in addition to what the Biden-Harris administration has already promised, I would just say, like, please don't forget the ocean. I know a lot of people in the new administration sticking up.
I've just got time for a couple more questions. Quick questions. And this one came in from Sophie.
Sorry, I'm so bad at like soundbite short answers, but
that's okay. That's okay. Sophie from Minneapolis, this is more of a personal question. She asked what argument would you find most effective for moving people from neutral to active on climate change issues? You know, like for people who maybe accept the science, who know climate change is real, but don't feel a sense of urgency about it.
I think that depends on like what motivates that person, right? For me, I just like feel bad if I'm not helping. Like to just watch things fall apart, there's not really joy or satisfaction in that. So I think I would just say like, hey, come with me and let's do this thing and like give it a try. Like no one said this had to be your day job for the rest of your life, but like, wouldn't it feel good if you were part of the solution instead of just watching the earth burn? So that's maybe not going to work for everybody. But if you can identify the superpowers that you see that they could be applying, maybe that will motivate them in a more specific way, right? Like if someone is an expert computer programmer and you're asking them to march, like, wouldn't it be better if we were asking them to use their computing skills, you know, or like web development for these nonprofits that need some help? Or there's even like massage therapists who are like offering, back in pre-pandemic days, they would like, you know, once a month show up at these like cash-strapped nonprofits and just like rub people's shoulders so they could keep doing their work, right? Like whatever, or therapists who are helping people talk through their fears about the climate crisis. Like we really do need this full spectrum of skills. So if you know this person, you could help them figure out a way to contribute more meaningfully that leverages what they're good at, but also like find a fun first thing to do.
Last question is something that you ask all of your podcast guests. And I wanted to turn the tables on you. You ask at the end of every podcast, you ask, are we screwed? So yeah. I know I'm in a church, so forgive me. Yeah. But you also brought up the issue or the characterization of you as being hopeful. I mean, so that's another way of phrasing it. Are you with your work, are you hopeful?
I am not hopeful. Decisively not hopeful. And it took me a few years to figure out why so many people thought I was hopeful. And it's because I'm joyful. And people conflate the two. Like I have no certainty that the future will be bright. But I still get to like find joy in like dancing around my living room and like making a good dinner and visiting my mom and watching the leaves emerge in spring. Like I can still enjoy all of the beauty in life, even though I'm like, who knows how long we're going to get to do this, you know? And so this question of how screwed are we is like, well, you know, the way we're going, pretty screwed. Like, I don't want to be on this fast track to hell. So how do we build a different track? How do we build a different train? I mean, we have a new president who's like obsessed with trains. Like maybe we'll finally get high-speed rail in America. Like I think how screwed are we it's the sort of unsatisfying answer of it depends. It depends what we do. It depends if we just watch it fall apart or if we chip in. And that's really hard to say, I understand, because figuring out that first step can be really, really hard. But I think what's important is, I guess I would say there's two ways to think about that. And in All We Can Save, there are two appendices that kind of mirror this thought process. The first one is a list of all the key climate solutions that we already have. So you could look at that list and see like, oh, I really want to work on reducing food waste and composting. Like, that's my jam. I want to turn like food scraps into soil that grows more food. Like, that's magic, and I want to do that. And that's great. Like, that could be your thing. Start, and don't just do it at home, because if you disappear tomorrow, the world is not going to, like, your lack of carbon footprint is not going to change things. But if you start a community thing, if you teach your family and friends to do these things, if we're not just like obnoxious evangelists for like asceticism, but if we like actually like, hey, like what if we did it this different way, and welcomed people in instead of just berating them and, you know, like sort of being obnoxious, right? You can't just yell facts at people until they do what you want. Like, that approach does not work unless you're like a really adorable child whose parents love you. Maybe it'll work. But you can think about it as a list of solutions, and you can think about it as a list of organizations to join, right? Like, I am so bolstered by the fact that there are all of these groups of people doing things they don't have to do because they know it's the right thing to do, because it's an opportunity to build a completely different and more equal and more beautiful and more abundant world, with, you know, clean air and clean water and green jobs and all of that stuff. Like, that is a future we could have. And so when I think about how screwed are we, I just think, I don't know, but I'm gonna keep doing my little part to make sure we're like as like that we're not totally screwed. I think there's this, I get up out of bed every morning and I'm like, what can I do to help make sure we have the best possible future? And that might still mean we're like 80% screwed. I honestly don't know, because the variable that we can't control is, what do people do, right? Like, what policies are actually going to get passed now that we have this window of opportunity in the federal government? What is going to happen at local levels with like public utility commissions, and what timelines are they going to set for shutting down coal plants? Like, are cities going to invest in public transit and put in more bike lanes? Like, I don't know what humans are going to do. I know that if we do all these things, we'll have a way better future. But, you know, often we just settle for the status quo. We don't understand how powerful we are to be a part of the change. And so we just don't do anything, or don't do as much as we could. And so if people like find that spark to engage in change that is like in these increasing circles that are bigger than themselves, if we think about changing systems instead of individual behavior, then things would be way better. But yeah, I have no idea what people are actually going to do. So who knows?
But still, that's a good note to end on. I'll say
it's
it.
Worth a shot, right? We might as well try.
Maybe not hopeful as you would define it, but joyful. I like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.